Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for making the effort and coming to listen to what I hope is a beginning of a conversation that I think is important to have, and probably would be even more important to have given the foreseeable developments on the ground in Israel and Palestine. I will try and speak slowly, not because there's anything wrong with me, but because my wife is a simultaneous translator, and I know how difficult it is for translators once lectures begin to run away with the words. So don't think that they have invited, or that the only Israeli that criticizes Zionism is a retarded Israeli. Thank you. As the director mentioned, there is an international consensus about the two-state solution. It's a formidable coalition, one should say, behind an idea that has not produced anything on the ground. The whole Arab League, the whole EU, the United States of America, Russia, conscientious voices such as the great philosopher Noam Chomsky, quite a few Palestinians and Israelis, and many other nation states, I'm sure, in the world, at least officially, if we include China or Brazil, would all say that as far as they can see, the only way forward is the creation of a two-state solution. So you need to be a bit of an eccentric like myself to say I'm not afraid of that coalition and tell them all one by one or together, I think you are wrong. And the reason I think that this is not the right paradigm has a lot to do with my understanding as a historian of Zionist history and ideology. It is not that I doubt the genuine wish on the Palestinian side to be content with a mini-state over 20% of Palestine, which is the biggest concession ever asked of a liberation movement, to fight only for 20% of its homeland. It's not that I doubt the good intention behind the support given by very good people, some of them my very good friends, who believe that this is a reasonable, rational solution given the reality on the ground. This is not the problem. For me, the problem is what I see as a misconception of when and how the two-state solution was born as a paradigm, and what, from an Israeli Zionist perspective, it was supposed to achieve. And this is very difficult to explain usually when you don't have enough time, because what you are asking people to be patient about is about the historical story. You will all notice that with the terrible events that are happening in Syria, and with the dramatic events that happened elsewhere in the Arab world, there was a media fatigue, media tiredness with Palestine. People said, how can you compare what's happening there with the dramatic events elsewhere? And one of the main reasons, I think, for that fatigue, for that inability to follow any longer the events in Palestine, was the fact that you cannot understand the situation in Palestine today only on the basis of what happened yesterday. Because yesterday maybe only one Palestinian house was demolished. Maybe only 5 Palestinian children were taken to jail, and only 10 Palestinian members of parliament were arrested without trial. Not a big deal compared to the horrific events that are happening or in the Middle East or elsewhere. So the media says, this is news number 7, news number 8. This cannot be at the head of the news. But if you take that day and you put it on a history of 100 years of colonization, of dispossession, of occupation, it becomes a great deal. And in many ways has to be news number 1 all the time. But it's very difficult to do that. And from this very same perspective, if you think that the two-state solution is an idea that was born in Oslo in 1993 by very good people on both the PLO side and Israel, with the support of the Norwegians and then the support of the rest of the world, this is a very distorted narrative of how the two-state solution came about and who really wanted it to be implemented. I will limit my talk today to the connection between 1948 and the two-state solution, although it deserves a far longer historical period. In fact, there is a direct connection between the very essence of the Zionist movement in the late 19th century and the Israeli perception of a two-state solution in 2013. But that may be too much to ask as an historical analysis. As you know, in 1948, the Zionist movement almost completed successfully the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The reason the Zionist movement believed that the only viable basis for a Jewish state in Palestine was of Palestine that it has hardly any Palestinian in it, was paradoxically the Zionist desire to create a Jewish and democratic state. If you want to create a state which is democratic, it doesn't matter whether there are Palestinians, Norwegians, or people from Spain in that country. But if you want the democracy to be Jewish, you have to make sure that the majority is all the time Jewish. It's a paradoxical situation. Now, how can you create a Jewish democracy when the Jews in 1948 are 1/3 of the population? How do you make a 1/3 into a 90% majority, which happened within 6 months? The only way you can do it, unless you are a magician, is by expelling the people, by destroying half of Palestine's villages, half of Palestine's cities, and in the area that became the State of Israel, which is 80% of mandatory Palestine, that is Israel today without the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, where 1 million Palestinians lived, only 150,000 Palestinians remained. That is to say that 90% of the Palestinians who lived in what became the State of Israel were expelled. History has very few examples of a country that loses 90% of its people. I don't know of any. I know of mass expulsions. You know too. I know. But I don't know of an expulsion of that proportion. Now, the Palestinian minority that stayed inside Israel was tolerated because it was immediately put, as some of you probably know the history of Israel and Palestine, it was immediately put under military rule. When you are under military rule, you are robbed of your most basic civil and human rights. And in a way, it doesn't matter how many you are, because I don't give you any rights, and the democracy can remain Jewish, because I'm imposing military rule on you. But the Israeli or the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel was not only interested in the issue of demography, of numbers of people. It was also interested in the issue of geography. Now, as you know, for national movement, as well as for colonial movements, such as Zionism, geography means two things. Geography means to have a space that is easy to defend, and therefore you are looking for natural borders. And in national terms, you want a space that holds the most important historical chapters in your chronology. So when the Zionist movement created the State of Israel, it was created from a Zionist perspective, without the heart of Israel. Hebron, Bethlehem, all the ancient biblical cities. And from a strategic point of view, those of you who are old enough may remember the famous quote by Abba Eban, a leftist Zionist, nonetheless, the first foreign minister of Israel, who said the borders that Israel had in the end of 1948, he called it the Auschwitz borders. Namely, a borders that can only signify one thing, another Holocaust for the Jewish people. This was the mentality of Israel between 1948 to 1967. Yes, we succeeded in having a demographic majority, but we have unviable or non-viable, borders. We need the heart of the ancient land of Israel, and we need a better border in the east, and they were thinking mainly about the river Jordan. Now, I don't have the time to question the accepted narrative of the 1967 war. I'm writing a book about it. I want you to read the book, so I'm not going to tell you. But I do not accept that 1967 was an Arab attack on Israel and that Israel had nothing to do with the June 67 war, but I'm leaving it for my next book so that at least some of you would buy it. But I think for my lecture, it's less important who was responsible for the 67 war. I'll come back to it if you re-invite me after this provocative lecture again. I will come back and talk about it gladly. But it doesn't really matter, however you understand why the June 67 war erupted, whatever your explanation is. What is not doubtful is the fact that Israel found itself in possession of the whole of mandatory Palestine. What is also not questionable, that there wasn't one Israeli politician in a senior position who said, okay, we occupied it, we go out. No. Israel, I remember it already, I was already then alive. I remember the enthusiasm, even if my most leftist Zionist friend, on the 10th of June 67. I remember my mother explaining to me that the Messiah has come, and she was a socialist Zionist who did not believe that God existed, but nonetheless she thought that on the 10th of June the Messiah has come. So June 67, at least we should agree, provided an opportunity to solve the geographical problem. But the geographical solution created a new demographic problem. You expelled 1 million Palestinians in 1948, but you incorporated another 1.5 million Palestinians in 1967. So you are back to the same problem. How are you going to have a Jewish democracy with an additional number of Palestinians? Now you could say, get rid of the territories and you don't have the demographic problem, but they didn't. And for many years I wanted to know why they did not. The official Israeli narrative was there was no one to talk to on the Arab side, and therefore there was no one to give the territories back to. But since then, we have all matured, and we know that the Israelis every 5 years say there is no one to talk to on the other side. And when there is someone to talk to on the other side, he either dies or loses his position. But more seriously, and that is to the credit of the Israelis, and another subject for another lecture, they do open their documents as if they do not think that will be a lot of people like me who would read it in such a way, but would read it in an entirely different way. So they've opened for us the 1967 documents. And the 1967 documents really give us a very good explanation for why the Israelis did not get out of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This had nothing to do with the absence of a partner. Why did they believe that they found a solution for the Jewish democracy while keeping the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as part of Israel? And you know, they've already kept it now for 46 years, longer than they kept the rest of Palestine, which was just for 19 years. And why did they believe that the solution that they found would be accepted internationally? I don't think they've hoped for a regional acceptance of that solution, but that came in a way as well. The government that had to make the decision about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip was a very unique government in the history of Israel. It was the 13th government. It had the widest possible representation of every political party in the Jewish community in Israel. From the ultra-Orthodox to the most secular, from the most left to the most right. It was the most consensual government ever to be established in Israel before and after. And that is important to mention because it gave them a sense that they can make historical decisions, because they really represented most of the Jews who lived in Israel at the time. It also included a very important group of people. Half of the people who made the final decision, in a way, about 1967, with which we live today, half of these people were generals in 1948 who supervised the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and were sure that it was a terrible mistake in 1948 not to occupy the West Bank and expel the Palestinians from the West Bank. In fact, when there were generals in 1948, they pushed the political leadership not to stop on the borders of the West Bank, but to occupy the West Bank as well and continue the expulsion of the Palestinians. Now, with all due respect to the Arab Legion, that was a formidable force, I don't think it would have been able to stop the Israelis had they decided to reach the Jordan River. But as you probably know, that's now a known fact, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Israel had an unwritten agreement, and under that unwritten agreement, the West Bank became part of Jordan, and Jordan only participated in the military campaign around Jerusalem. And these generals at the time, in 1948, thought it was a terrible mistake. And ever since 1948, whenever there was the slightest violation in their eyes of the Israeli-Jordanian armistice agreement, they said, now we have the excuse to occupy the West Bank. And until 1963, when the Prime Minister of Israel was David Ben-Gurion, he stopped these ideas. He said, we may have the right, in his eyes, to do it, but we will have a demographic problem. So he was against it. But once he retired from politics, these generals, like Yigal Allon, Moshe Dayan, Carmel, and others, became the most important political figures in Israel. And they found a gray kind of clerk called Levi Eshkol to be at the head of the government, but he was not very important. They were far more important than the prime minister, who had a problem with reputation because he didn't talk well in public, He looked in panic before the 67 war, and Dayan was the hero of Israel. And Dayan led the discussions in 1967. And the Israelis in 1967 decided three things, and not one Israeli politician, to my mind, not even the late Yitzhak Rabin, have deviated from these three decisions. And I think it's important to know about this decision. One doesn't have to agree with my analysis that they are still the backbone of Israeli policy, because I don't think Israel took any new strategic decision about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip ever since. The first decision they had to take: can we get rid of the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as we got rid of the people of the rest of Palestine? And they decided not to continue with the ethnic cleansing. They said, in 1948, we expelled people during the war. Now the war is over. In 1948, there was no television. In 1967, there was television. The people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, half of them are refugees. Can we expel refugees once more? It will be more difficult. The army in 67 is not made of the same quality as the army in 48. Maybe the soldiers will not be strong enough to execute the ethnic cleansing, they said. So they decided to leave most of the Palestinians. I know there were expulsions. I'm aware of it. I'm a historian. I know about the expulsions of the refugee camps in Jericho, of people from Qalqilia, from the Muslim quarter in the Jewish quarter, rather. Sorry, the Muslims who lived in the Jewish quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. But I'm talking about something that is similar to what happened in 1948, did not happen in 1967. Okay, so you don't expel the people. What about giving back the territories? It's amazing how short the collective memory of the world is. I thought I had to go to the archives to find a secret Israeli decision that tells the world that although Israel is willing to withdraw from the Golan Heights and from the Sinai for peace with Syria and Egypt respectively, it is not going to withdraw physically from the West Bank, but it is willing to negotiate any kind of other solution of the West Bank. I was surprised to know, I didn't even remember it, that the Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol had 3 public press conferences in which he said that in a very clear way. He said the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are not negotiable in the same way as the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And when he was asked to clarify what he meant, he said, I cannot envisage an Israeli withdrawal from these territories, which are the ancient land of Israel. This is before one Jewish settler even landed in the occupied territories. The secret documents, I call them secret, I mean they were closed to the historian for 30, 40 years, are now open. The secret documents show something else, that the government said, is it wise for the Prime Minister to say it aloud? We all agree with him that Israel will never, ever withdraw from the West Bank. They were not sure about the Gaza Strip. Unfortunately, nobody is ever totally sure about the Gaza Strip. But they were not sure, they were sure about the West Bank. But the question that they debated was, shall we tell the world that if we've actually decided in principle that the West Bank is part of Israel? And the reason that they decided to do it is because they did not, and this I will grant them, they did not yet know what it meant to stay in the West Bank. It was too early. But they knew that in the Sinai, for instance, at least some of them knew, you can give back the whole of Sinai and you have peace with Egypt. There is no such formula for the West Bank. So, you're not expelling the people, you are keeping the territories. So what is going to happen to the people? They've asked themselves this question. And they devised 3 mechanisms for controlling the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. One, I call it, this is not their words, these are now my words to what they have decided. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not quoting them, but this is how I understand it. One was to suggest that if the Palestinians would accept an Israeli control over the West Bank, in the areas where there is a Palestinian majority in terms of population, there can be a Palestinian autonomy. Already in 1967, they said, we don't care if that autonomy one day will be called a state. It doesn't bother us. But they have to behave well. Namely, they cannot reject our total control. I call it the open prison model. In an open prison, you get autonomy, you can get some rewards, like working outside the prison, if you behave well, and if you're not a dangerous inmate. However, that's a second decision, should you decide to resist, and as probably some of you know, especially in the refugee camps in the Gaza Strip in 1967-68, but also in some parts of the West Bank, definitely in 69-70 in the Jordan Valley, the Palestinian Liberation Organization conducted a guerrilla warfare against the occupation. The government said, if such a thing would happen, we will impose, instead of the open prison, maximum security prison. And they've already had all the repertoire for how to do this. Collective punishment that included demolition of houses, arrest without trial, everything that may now horrify you about the Israeli behavior in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip was already exercised on a daily basis from the 11th of June 1967. So that was the second decision. Either they behave well and they have an open prison that can be called a state, or they will be locked in a way like the Gaza Strip today is locked, or how the West Bank was treated in the Defense Shield operation in 2002. The last decision that they have taken is very relevant to what I wanted to conclude with. What do we say to the world? How do we react to an international community that a month after June 1967 passes a resolution put forward by Britain and France, Resolution 242, that implies quite clearly that the only way towards peace is an Israeli withdrawal from all the territories Israel occupied in return for peace. They decided that this is not a dangerous resolution for two reasons. They adopted a kind of a lawyer's, and I don't want to offend anyone, I have a lot of admiration for lawyers, but this is a lawyer's thing. They said, let's take the text of 242 and say that it's too elusive, and they invented this Hebrew translation. Some of you may know it. They took the resolution and said, it doesn't say withdrawal from all the territories, but just from territories. So the British ambassador said, not true. I mean, I know, I phrase it. It says from the territories. They said, yes, but you don't understand Hebrew. You see, it's very difficult to translate the territories to Hebrew. It is difficult ideologically, by the way, not linguistically, to translate it. So they played with it for about 3 or 4 years to gain time. Then they said, does it really matter what the United Nations decides? And since then, Israel ignored, as you know, 77 resolutions of the United Nations. And even before that, it ignored the most important United Nations resolution of 914 that demanded the return of the refugees. So ignoring a United Nations resolution was not a big deal. You needed only half an hour of meeting of a cabinet in Jerusalem. There was a more difficult question, always a more difficult question in Israel. What to do with the American response? Because the Americans, at least officially, sponsored Resolution 242. And I'm very intrigued. all the references to what the Americans said about it in the Israeli documents I've seen have been erased by the censor. But I'm an historian, so I went to see the American documents. It's all there. So they thought they were very clever by erasing, so that if you read Hebrew, you cannot read what the Americans said to the Israelis. But you go to the American documents, you can read exactly the things that the censor in Israel has erased. And these are not very nice things that the American administration says to Israel about its decision to unilaterally annex East Jerusalem, to say publicly that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are not negotiable. The Americans were furious, were really furious. And Abba Eban, who was the Israeli foreign minister, was a bit worried about that. But he was a voice in the wilderness. Moshe Dayan said to him, what will the Americans do? They will abandon us? They will punish us? Okay, let's answer to them that we respect very much their ideas, we'll talk about it, we'll discuss it. In the meantime, Yigal Allon will build the first settlement in the Jordan Valley, then he will build the first settlement in Kiryat Arba, near Hebron. We've already taken the greater Jerusalem area. We have created the corridor between, this is all in the first 2 months after the occupation. We've already created, as he called it, irreversible facts that make anyway the American demand ridiculous. So we can say to them that we agree with them, while unilaterally continuing to do it on the ground. What I'm trying to say to you is that in 1967, and ever since 1967, the Israeli perception of the two states is two things. One, it is the perception that matters. You know it better than I do. 46 years later, is the Spanish interpretation of the two-state solution important? Show me one fact on the ground that is reflecting the Spanish interpretation of the two-state solution. Is the Arab League interpretation of the two-state solution important? Show me one fact on the ground that shows that it has any impact on the reality. It's even said, is the Palestinian interpretation of the two-state solution reflected on the ground? No. 46 years onwards, the only interpretation of the two-state solution that is reflected on the ground is the Israeli interpretation. The consensual, I'm not talking about the extreme right wing in Israel. For them, the interpretation is even worse. I'm talking about the Israelis who were even behind the Oslo Accord. The interpretation, and with this I will conclude, because I don't know if we have questions? Yeah, so I really want to leave time. I will conclude with this. For them, the interpretation is, we have a good solution for you. We will try not to settle where most of the Palestinians live, and we will try to let you live autonomously in those areas. Unfortunately, they said already in 1993, they said it even more in 2007. Unfortunately, we had the settler movement which we could not control, which I doubt, never mind. We had the settler movement which we could not control, and they settled outside our own map of the autonomy. And we are also willing for the autonomy now seriously to be called a state. But if you notice, the Israeli notion is that part of the West Bank, especially the outer parts of the West Bank, have to be under Israeli control. And that the greater Jerusalem area is not a settlement. This is a natural growth of the urban sprawl of Jerusalem. It's like an amoeba. Every year you look at the map of the city of Jerusalem, it gets bigger and bigger. If you're not careful, it will swallow Madrid. You have to be careful. It's moving very quickly towards Spain. It is amazing. And not much is left of the West Bank after the greater Jerusalem is growing. That is the interpretation that dictates the reality on the ground. And that is the only interpretation of the two-state solution, to my mind, that matters. And that's why I think it is, we wasted time and energy of a solution that was not a solution to the problem, that excluded the Palestinian refugees, excluded the Palestinians inside Israel, excluded 80% of Palestine. We were, according to the Jewish joke, we were looking for the key we have lost, not where we have lost the key, but where there was light. It's time to go back to the darkness and look for the key. Thank you.